But now. And now, we welcome you back to another edition of Third Phase of Moon Radio. I'm your host, Dr. J. Andy Elias. Joining me today is the founder of Third Phase of Moon, Blake Cousins. And we are speaking to none other than Jim Marrs. He is a New York Times best-selling author. He was a writer for the New York Times. He actually was a professor. He's been so much more, and he is here with us today. How you doing, Jim?
Well, I'm doing tolerable.
Blake, how you doing today, too?
Well, I'm doing pretty tolerable myself, and we got all kinds of questions for Mr. Jim Marrs. His topics are wide, and they range in all different aspects, and we're going to get to it. Dr. J.
That's right. You know, Jim Marrs has written on so many important topics, everything from JFK, which actually he was an advisor to Oliver Stone's JFK movie, and 9/11. Aliens, and so much more. And I wanted to jump into it with this because, Jim Marrs, you've written so many different books on so many different topics. The newest one is Our Occulted History. My personal favorite was The Fourth Reich. I haven't gotten this new one yet, but I will. But I wanted to ask you, out of all those conspiracies, what is your favorite conspiracy?
Oh, boy. That's hard to say. Well, I'll tell you what, though. Let me do this. Here is not my favorite, but not only proof that conspiracy exists, but what I do consider as the greatest conspiracy going on in the world today. Guys, if you stop and think, I think you'll all agree with me that right now, today, we have available off-the-shelf technology that we should be able to feed, clothe, house, and give basic medical attention to every single living person on the planet Earth, okay? Now, we all know this. Now, however, as we're speaking right now, and we don't like to think about this, but we know that around the world there are literally thousands, if not millions, of children starving to death. Whoa, wait a minute. Now, why is that? No, I don't want that. I don't think anybody even listening wants that. Okay, so why is it that way, since we have the technology to take care of that problem? Well, I submit to you because somewhere somebody wants it that way. If nobody wanted it that way, it wouldn't be that way. So there you go, guys. It's the greatest conspiracy going, and the proof that there's conspiracy going on in the world.
And Mr. Marrs, you are such a seasoned investigator on that topic, and you touched on something very important that actually Dr. Edgar Mitchell, who spoke with us last week, said about this cabal, this small group of people that's controlling the planet. You said it yourself, famine, disease, all that going on, and yet we have the technology. Why is it being hidden? Because that small group of people would collapse the entire oil economy, wouldn't you say? And doesn't this technology come from extraterrestrials?
Well, now you're talking about my latest book, Our Occulted History, okay? Which, let me point out real quick that the word occulted, I use that this is not a book about zombies or witches or Satan worshipers, anything that we kind of normally think of as the occult. I use the word occulted in the astronomical sense, meaning when the moon eclipses the sun, it's called an occultation. The moon occults the sun, which simply means hidden. It hides or masks the sun. So our occulted history actually just refers to our hidden history that you're not taught about in school. And it's really amazing. And the bottom line is, yes, we are not, and probably have never been, alone, the lone intelligent species in our solar system. And I say our solar system because I start off my book, Our Occulted History, talking about all of the anomalous facts and information that we have about our own solar system. Even Carl Sagan, early in his career, teamed up with some Russian scientists, and they were claiming that the Martian moon of Phobos was probably hollow. And as Sagan pointed out, a hollow object cannot be a natural object. So they were talking about Phobos being some sort of a Death Star, a la Star Wars. And then it just goes on from there. And of course, we have pyramids on the Mars, pyramids on the Moon, and they reflect the same configurations as the pyramids here on Earth. And speaking of pyramids, which I read in my new book, Our Occulted History, is that the pyramids are not simply relegated to the Giza Plateau in Egypt. We have those pyramids. There's pyramids in Central America, South America, China, Eastern Europe. There's pyramids all over the world, and what it gives evidence to is the idea that there was a highly evolved, intelligent, and highly technological civilization on this planet long before we came along. And so, again, this is part of our occulted history, our hidden history.
Well, not only pyramids in those part of the world, even right here, possibly in Hawaii, where we live, some of the ancient Hawaiians and their structures were very familiar to pyramidal structures. And it's quite interesting that it got to be a worldwide phenomenon with how could it have been done, everybody thinking like-minded. There's something that was going on, and the communication was getting around, and the history books, I think, are wrong. I want to get down to the history and what's going on, this, kind of who's going to shoot or fire next right there in Syria. And now the Russians just came out with some video that shows possibly of what looks to be rebels shooting off these chemical weapons. Do you think this is some of the NWO, New World Order conspiracy at work here, Jim?
Oh, absolutely. See, there are little-known organizations with our own government that are either acting on behalf of the New World Order and not our elected government. For instance, one is called Direct Commercial Sales. It's a little group under the State Department that they are in charge of selling weapons to other nations, as opposed to the weapons that we give to other nations. Now, we send weapons all around the world to various nations. Israel receives a whole potload from us, and those oftentimes are gifts. We just give it to them. But then we allow the private sector sales. So there are U.S. arms corporations that are selling arms all over the world. And apparently the monitoring system to find out who ends up with these arms is pretty weak, okay? For example, we have spent over $4 billion on arms that we, through licenses with the State Department, perfectly legal, have sold to the Mexican government, okay, for their use of their military. In years past, this was on the war on drugs. Well, there have been thousands of Mexican soldiers who, either out of political idealism or just bought and paid for corruption, have defected from the Mexican military, and they have sold these very arms that we produce to the Mexican drug gangs. And this is why we've seen this ever-rising tide of violence, terrible loss of life along the Texas-Mexican border, in fact, the whole southern border, Arizona and New Mexico, California. And yet the mass media doesn't want to talk about that because the State Department tells them, well, no, this could damage our relationship with Mexico, and these are matters of national security. No, they are matters of profit for the arms manufacturers of this country. Now, as far as Syria goes, I'm still waiting for the answers to two questions, which I think should be very basic. One, who actually fired the poison gas? Now, the UN inspectors apparently have confirmed that poison sarin gas was used on civilians in Syria, which is, of course, just a tragedy, and that's just terrible. But first, we have to determine who actually used it. And number two, we have to determine where did it come from. Syria doesn't make its own poisonous chemical weapons, so where'd they get it? All right, whether it's the rebels who, even the mainstream media admits we've been arming the rebels, or they may have stolen stockpiles from Assad's army. Or Assad's army may have actually fired the gas. But that doesn't make any sense because Assad, number one, has been holding his own. It seems like that they've kind of reached a stalemate there, In fact, it looks like the tide may have been turning towards the Assad government, away from the rebels. And so Assad had every reason not to gas civilians, and the rebels had every reason to do that and blame it on Assad. And of course, false flag operations have been the vogue in recent years. What you do is you attack somebody and then blame it on somebody else. That's what's known as a false flag. That goes back to the days of the warfare on the sea in the 1800s, when, say, a British ship would approach a French ship when they were at war, and they would hoist up a French flag, and they would approach the French ship, and when they got within gun range, they'd open up on them and disable them and then board them and capture the ship, and then they'd run up or at the last minute, they'd run up the Union Jack and capture the ship operation. And we've seen that all the time here in the United States. In fact, it's been used on us. There are a great number of people who have carefully studied the evidence and are convinced that 9/11 was a false flag operation. Yes, there were airplanes hijacked, and yes, there was terrible damage and loss of life, but it still has not been determined who exactly was behind that. And if you think I'm just talking some conspiracy theory, I want you to hark to the words of John Farmer. John Farmer is a former Attorney General of New Jersey and is not a conspiracy theorist or an author. He is, or was, the senior counsel to the official 9/11 Commission, the chief lawyer of Bush's own committee to investigate what happened on 9/11. And he has stated publicly that the account given to the 9/11 Commission staff, and hence to the Congress and to the media and to the public about what happened on 9/11 is entirely untrue. Well, wait a minute. If the chief lawyer of the official 9/11 Commission says the version they gave us is entirely and inexplicably untrue, then I think we owe it to the victims to find out what actually happened.
There are several references to what was happening at 3,500 years ago, 4,500 years ago, like you said, in the Sumerian culture and around that era. And a lot of the descriptions were exactly what would be happening if there was a radiation fallout today or a nuclear weapon going off. Now, clearly, if they were using nuclear weapons at the time, do you think the reason they were doing so was because there was fighting factions of two different kinds of extraterrestrials that were possibly looking to enslave the human race or have them develop in one direction versus another direction?
Well, that's always possible. I think there's been some, there may have been some interstellar war going on. And when I say war, struggles, conflicts, it may not have been an actual shooting war since time immemorial. But I think, according to the Sumerian tablets, the warfare that took place, which you can read recounted, for example, in the Old Testament, King so-and-so warned on King so-and-so, who warred on so-and-so, and allied with so-and-so and warred on somebody else. I think laying behind all that was conflicts between the Anunnakis themselves. In fact, here's an interesting theory, and what if there were rebel forces trying to war against the Anunnaki leadership, and it escalated into atomic warfare, which laid waste to Mesopotamia and huge portions there in the Middle East, denuded the place of trees and vegetation, turned whole areas into just desert, essentially, unlike that, and that the righteous Anunnakis said, hey, this is terrible, we're out of here. And they left some of the dissident Anunnaki marooned on the earth. And they then became like Charlton Heston. They were marooned on the planet of the apes. And the apes being us, the primitive humans. And just like Charlton Heston, he doesn't want to be just another ape. He wants to run the planet of the apes. And yet you cannot physically control 7 billion apes. So how do you gain control? You do it through secrecy, and the main thing is through the old divide and conquer strategy. You keep the apes fighting with each other, and that way they never have time to look up and realize who is actually lording it over them. And these dissidents, these rebels, have been waiting all throughout our recorded history for the opportunity to try to return into space, but they've never had the technology. For example, if you and I went in a time machine back to 1860, say, that's not that far back, and we would know about an automobile. But could we build an automobile? No, because we wouldn't have had the infrastructure to even create a spark plug or a carburetor. You know, even though we know how it works, they couldn't make one like that. Well, they've been in the same situation. They haven't had the technology to get ahead, but today they do. We now are reaching into space ourselves. We now have the ability to go into space. We now have all this boom in technology of miniaturization, computers, and all the know-how so that they might be able to go and return to their homes in space. And it could be that the cops are on the way back to try to set things straight. And the scary part is that the people, these dissidents, these rebels, who are trying to control the earth, may convince us that we're being invaded by horrible aliens and get us to fight their fight for them.
Well, it seems like it is coming to full circle again from the ancient Sumerian times with the technology that they may have received, like you were saying earlier, nuclear technology. Even in some of the Sumerian drawings, there is detail of what looks to be 3-stage rockets. Like they were doing 3-stage rockets, and back in the day, they had a mission control. And back to what you're saying, and Dr. J was saying, was there a conflict? Was there a faction going against each other? Well, it seems to me that there was, because when God was going to do the great deluge and wipe out mankind and everything involved with it, that there was some technology given to a certain fellow by the name of Noah, and that must have come from another godlike person. And apparently the Noah ship resembled, instead of a boat, more like a submarine, and it sounded like their conflict. Why would God want to take out planet Earth and the humans and then give the opportunity to Noah to have it go on? I think there was some kind of inside conspiracy to keep the human race going.
Well, I think you hit on a critical point there. You know, if you go back and study the Old Testament, look at the account of the Tower of Babel, it says God said, "Let us go down and you know, let's confound their language, or otherwise they're going to try to become the same as us." And we see all of a sudden here's a slip up where when the Bible translators, in trying to transmute the ancient gods to the singular monotheistic God, they just kind of slipped up and left a quote in there that "Come, let us go down." And I think that actually what it was there was more than the one. Now, let me quickly add for all the religious people out there, I'm not saying that that God's an alien. I think there is my personal belief is that there is one creative, intelligent, sentient force in the universe, and that pretty well fits the definition of themselves. When it was argued that they should tweak the DNA, improve the breed, if you will, and create this worker race, they had the same arguments over ethics that we're having. And a lot of them argued that, you know, it's not our purpose to play God, and we can't do that. You know, which tells me they also understood that there was a universal God. But to believe in a universal God is one thing. To believe in extraterrestrial interference in the history of the earth, that's something else again. In fact, I'm reminded of a woman who had recurring abduction experiences, and she was a very religious person, and she finally asked him, said, "But what about God? Are you all from God?" You know, and they were just kind of disgusted, and they said, "Hey, our God is your God. You know, there isn't one God of the universe. No matter what name you want to call him, her, it, And so we're not talking about that. We're talking about the Anunnaki who came here and were proclaimed themselves God so that they could rule over the human population.
Clearly, we have been engaged by some extraterrestrial race, if not races, plural, for millennia, if not longer than that. What was the impact of these extraterrestrial contacts to Germany, the Third Reich, pre-World War II, that gave them such an ambition and technology that overcame ours at the beginning?
I'm sure you're well aware. I mean, everybody is, thanks to the Indiana Jones movies, that the Nazis went all around the world searching for occult icons, symbols, sacred sites, etc., because they were well aware of what we're talking about. Okay, now this is all thought to have been, fantasy and hogwash by so many people up until now, but there's a growing number of people who have actually studied the evidence, and they realize that there's really something here. And as a result, the Nazis were into it, and they were found a way to obtain ET technology. In fact, in my book, The Rise of the Fourth Reich, I give the documentation and evidence showing that at the end of World War II, the Nazis actually had developed an atomic bomb. The reason they didn't do it was because they were late to the game, and they did not have a effective and reliable delivery system. They had a 3-stage rocket, but they couldn't really guide it. They had some 6-engine bombers that were awaiting a mission in base in Norway. In fact, the crews up there said they were told they were going to go on a New York mission. And I have a copy of the 1942 Luftwaffe study of atomic bomb blast radius on Manhattan Island. But they didn't have it. This airfield wasn't quite ready. And by the time it was, and by the time they thought maybe they had a reliable delivery system, it was already mid-spring 1945, and the Allies were closing in from the west, and the Russians were closing in from the east. And the Russian leadership knew, and I'm not talking about Hitler. He was already on a roller coaster ride of amphetamines and all kinds of bad drugs. I'm talking about his chief of staff, Morton Bormann, and the head of the German Central Bank and the head of IG Farben Combine. And they realized that the end was in sight. They also knew if they had nuked New York, that the Allies would have obliterated Germany, and nobody wanted that. So they cut a deal, and when the German army military surrendered at Reims in 1945, there was nobody representing the Nazi Party. We just forced the Nazis to move, and a lot of them came over here under Operation Paperclip, and what they did quite succinctly was to swap us their nuclear technology in exchange for immunity.
Well, in a way, we have to thank Hitler by making the right choices and getting the smartest people on the planet to, come up with this technology, because if it wasn't for that, I don't think we'd be where we're at in America with the technology and what we get to appreciate every day. It's very ironic.
That's true. I know it is very ironic that we may, in years to come, actually realize that we owe a little bit of gratitude and thanks to Adolf Hitler, because he was a little ahead of his time, and by using this advanced technology and stuff for his evil purposes, he has given us a little guiding light as to don't do this, okay? In fact, I can remember all through my life when somebody comes up and says, okay, we need to squash these liberties and we need to subvert these liberties and we need to do this and that, the cry almost immediately is, well, this is like the Nazis. So he showed us exactly what we should not be doing, okay? And that's because at the heart of the Nazi philosophy, just as it was at the heart of the communist philosophy and the Illuminati philosophy and the New World Order of today, the basic philosophy is the end justifies the means, okay? In other words, you can claim to be anything you want to. You can do anything you want to, up to and including murder. you can just, whatever, if it advances your goal, if the end justifies the means. And of course, I was always taught that the end does not necessarily justify the means.
Speaking of murder, you worked on the movie JFK with Oliver Stone and the murder of our president JFK. You know, what surprised me the most about that whole event, besides, you know, the 300 people closely related, all dying of suspicious causes, and the chances of that would be 1 in a trillion, that's all out there. But the thing that surprised me the most is the Zapruder film and how it took 14 years to finally become public, and it came out on the late night show with Geraldo Rivera. Tell me about that, and what do you think about that in pertaining to the Bin Laden video footage and photos of his death? Is that ever going to come out? Is it going to take 14?
Yeah, no, it's going to take another 50 years. Interestingly enough, the SEAL team members who probably could have told us the truth about what happened on the Bin Laden raid all got killed in a helicopter crash in Afghanistan, or so we were told. And then there's another few who've written books and say, I was there and we did this and we did that. And unfortunately, their stories conflict sometimes. And I don't think these folks are lying. I think they're telling you exactly what they know. But if you really look at it objectively and closely, you find that the people who said, well, I was there and I saw this and I did that, they did not know who they were after until the last minute. And then they were told, you're going to get Bin Laden. So they already were preconditioned. And then when some guy steps out and they shoot him down and they grab him, you know, and they hustle him off, they're told, hey, good for you. You got Bin Laden. Well, you know, okay, two things here. Number one, why didn't they bring the body back, have it autopsied, and let everybody look so we'll all know they got Bin Laden? No, we're told they dumped the body in the ocean. Come on, that's mafia-style stuff, you know? And then, but better than that, you know, if they had to shoot him, maybe they didn't have to shoot him, but if they had to shoot him, they'd shoot him in the leg, and they all got out to bring him back with them, and we'd put him on trial, and we'll show the whole world that America is a place of justice, and that here he is, and here's the evidence against him, you know. But hey, that'll never happen now, will it? So it leaves it wide open for the conspiracy theorists to say, hey, we're not even sure that was him, and we're not even sure that he did 9/11. In fact, Osama bin Laden is on the record is saying that he, even though he kind of agreed with the goals of the 9/11 attacks, that he didn't do it.
First of all, the CIA and of our government is known to fund people and then dump them. And we funded Bin Laden and the Mujahideen, I believe.
Yeah, for you to say.
Yeah, in Iran, because they were the only ones fighting, or Afghanistan, sorry. They were the only ones fighting the Soviets. So we would give them money, we would give them arms, and then as soon as the conflict was over, we said, we don't know you, and we basically left them. So, of course, he built some sort of a hatred. And I believe we had the same issue with Fidel Castro and all that. But now... Well,
it's the same thing they did in 1963. You know, there was a conspiracy to kill President Kennedy, but they laid it off on that schnook Oswald, okay? And now 9/11, big conspiracy. I mean, you know, are we really supposed to believe that some Muslim hotheads using little box cutters are supposed to have been able to take over 4 airliners and guide them unerringly to these 3 buildings, and all the while under the control of this Muslim cleric using a laptop computer in a cave in Afghanistan? I mean, I've been accused of being a conspiracy theorist, but I got to tell you guys, that's the worst conspiracy theory I've ever heard. It's ridiculous, you know. We had built a $40 billion defense system against some of the most technological advanced nations in the world, like Russia and China, and you tell me that these snooks, you know, can suddenly defeat that whole thing? For instance, I know that the Pentagon is one of the most protected buildings in the world. It is ringed by automatic missile batteries. If you try to fly into the airspace over the Pentagon and you're not transmitting a friendly transponder signal, these batteries open up on you and they're going to shoot you out of the sky. So how come nothing happened on 9/11? Okay? There's just too many unanswered questions. And you also might realize that the reason these questions haven't been answered and that the fact that the senior counsel of the 9/11 Commission staff has said publicly that the story they were given is entirely untrue, is because to reveal the truth would reveal that it was an inside job. There were people, and yet there were people in the government who may have participated in that, and to this day don't realize that they were what they were doing, because they were part of military exercises that were going on at the time. Now, for a year or more after 9/11, they kept denying that any of that happened, but now it's all on the record. Vigilant warrior, vigilant guardian, tripod exercises, all of this, and some of these exercises in the military were carrying out the scenario of hijacked planes flying into the World Trade Center. Holy cow. And I know in the Central Command, when they saw the CNN reports the plane had crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center, they were just aghast. They were asking each other, how can this happen? This is the very thing we're diagramming, and now it's happening in real life. And yet that was denied for a long time.
Third phase of the moon.
It is conspiracy going, and the proof that there's conspiracy going on in the world.
And Mr. Mars, you are such a seasoned investigator on that topic, and you touched on something very important that actually Dr. Edgar Mitchell, who spoke with us last week, said about this cabal, this small group of people that's controlling the planet. You said it yourself, famine, disease, all that going on, and yet we have the technology. Why is it being hidden? Because that small group of people would collapse the entire oil economy, wouldn't you say? And doesn't this technology come from extraterrestrials?
Well, now you're talking about my latest book, Our Occulted History. Okay.
They range in all different aspects, and we're going to get to it, Dr. J.
That's right. Jim Mars has written on so many important topics, everything from JFK, which actually he was an advisor to Oliver Stone's JFK movie, and 9/11, aliens, and so much more. And I wanted to jump into it with this because, Jim Mars, you've written so many different books on so many different topics. The newest one is Our Occulted History. My personal favorite was the Fourth Reich. I haven't gotten this new one yet, but I will. But I wanted to ask you, out of all those conspiracies, what is your favorite conspiracy?
Oh, boy. That's what we're speaking right now. And we don't like to think about this, but we know that around the world there are literally thousands, if not millions, of children starving to death. Whoa, wait a minute. Now, why is that? No, I don't want that. I don't think anybody even listening wants that. Okay, so why is it that way, since we have the technology to take care of that problem? Well, I submit to you because somewhere somebody wants it that way. If nobody wanted it that way, it wouldn't be that way. So there you go, guys. It's hard to say. Well, I'll tell you what, though. Let me do this. Here is not my favorite, but not only proof that conspiracy exists, but what I do consider as the greatest conspiracy going on in the world today. Guys, if you stop and think, I think you'll all agree with me that right now, today, we have available off-the-shelf technology that we should be able to feed, clothe, house, and give basic medical attention to every single living person on the planet Earth, okay? Now, we all know this. Now, however, but now.
And now, we welcome you back to another edition of Third Phase of Moon Radio. I'm your host, Dr. J. Andy Elias. Joining me today is the founder of Third Phase of Moon, Blake Cousins, and we are speaking to none other than Jim Mars. He is a New York Times best-selling author. He was a writer for the New York Times. He actually was a professor. He's been so much more, and he is here with us today. How you doing, Jim?
Well, I'm doing tolerable.
Blake, how you doing today, too?
Well, I'm doing pretty tolerable myself, and we got all kinds of questions for Mr. Jim Mars. His topics are wide, and